If that's okay.
Yes. So, hello and welcome to WPVM special edition with Angelica Wind with Our Voice. Angelica is here today to discuss their upcoming fundraiser, which we all are very familiar with and very much enjoy, and talk about the how Our Voice is handling the pandemic, the COVID situation, since they're such an important service to the community. And I'm sure that there have been some adaptations and restrictions that you've had to deal with. Welcome, Angelica. I'm glad to see you back here again.
Oh, I'm so happy to be back here again and see a familiar face. And I really appreciate an opportunity for us to talk about our upcoming fundraiser, our signature fundraiser, Break the Silence Speaker Series. And this year we're exceptionally excited because we have Chanel Miller as our featured guest.
Yes, and so first let's start into how has the pandemic impacted Our Voice?
Well, I'm sure that you probably have not come across anybody that hasn't been impacted by the pandemic. And we, as the Sexual Assault Agency and Prevention Center, we were not immune to its impact. When COVID first started, we experienced a real dramatic decrease in services. And I believe that part of it is because folks, when they think about essential workers and essential services, they're not thinking about their local rape crisis and prevention center. And so we saw a sharp decrease, but in an effort to spread the word, we came up with a campaign to inform people that we were still open and that we were available to give services. In addition, we had to convert the majority of our services to a virtual platform. We were able to do it a lot more smoothly than I anticipated and a lot more quickly. And what we've seen in the last few months is seen our numbers increase, not to pre-pandemic days, but certainly getting closer.
So then you're able to have consultations with people that are needing assistance using a virtual interview process?
Yeah, so we are able to offer telecounseling services through a virtual, means. The same way with medical accompaniment for individuals that present at Mission Hospital wanting a forensic examination. We have the ability to connect because we're not allowed to go physically in there. So we are able to do that via an iPad. In addition, as always, we still have the majority of our services for in person at the Family Justice Center. So we are still doing forensic examinations where the same nurses are, and we're providing medical accompaniment for that. We're also able to do case management virtually. We can't do court advocacy, but we are able to support a survivor nonetheless through that process. Our priority is to ensure that there is no gap in services and that we're able to offer them in a responsible manner that keeps both the survivor and the advocate safe.
Mhm. So, give us some statistics on uh, sexual assault allegations and events, and have you noticed an increase in that or decrease now that we're in such a strange situation?
So, thank you for asking that question. So, sexual violence continues to be one of the most underreported crimes and still is very much the case. What we've seen is due to the pandemic, a lot of survivors are not coming out of their homes. They want to be safe and accessing those services. What we do know is that sexual violence still continues to be at the same rate. There hasn't been much of a defect, but we also know is that we talk about human trafficking, is that anytime that there is a national disaster, there is a sharp uptick in victims of human trafficking or human trafficking victimization. And what we don't see now, but we will see once we're in a different place with the pandemic, is that we anticipate seeing an increase of survivors of human trafficking that reach out for services. And so that is what we're preparing right now, especially now that we have the vaccine, knowing that this is coming down the line because we know that people are more vulnerable for sexual and labor exploitation when there is a national crisis that impacts our housing stability, our ability to make to earn an income, and so forth. So that's like uh, prime for human traffickers to identify and prey on those vulnerabilities. And so that's what we're expecting to happen in the next few months.
So, how does Our Voice do outreach to victims of sexual trafficking and actually people stuck in their homes suffering from abuse?
Absolutely. So we've had to be a little bit more creative. We have obviously used our social media. We have such a strong social media presence, but we've also wanted to amplify our voice by having some ads on YouTube, some print ads. But more than anything, what we've done is offered uh, virtual trainings for community members, because while we might not be able to have physical contact with to be able to do the outreach the way that we were able to do in the past, what we're relying is on community members to support us. And so we are having an increase of virtual workshops where community members can gain the tools, the lenses to be able to spot for sexual violence or human trafficking victimization, and how to have conversations with someone that we suspect in a manner that permits them to be safe and not pushing them to disclose. The other piece is that we've also had to do is have interviews like this to educate folks around, as well as our community partners, that we're still up and open, and that we are here to serve survivors.
Well, good. I'm glad you're able to rise to the occasion. COVID has given us all some tests to see how nimble we can be in doing the jobs that we're here to do. So I want to go to the Asheville school situation. Recently, there have been we've heard some news about sexual assault allegations that occurred at the Asheville school. And this has been reported by some of their alumni. What's your thoughts on that situation?
Well, I really can't comment specifically to Asheville School, but I can comment of what we see in schools in general. It certainly underscores the importance of Title IX, and I know that this past administration there was an erosion of Title IX, and there was a lot of confusion of what Title IX is and what IX isn't. And what I can say is that parents need to be involved, students need to be involved, alumni need to be involved of all these educational institutions to ensure that if there is some form of victimization in those schools, that we have a school that is prepared to respond to it, and that they have the resources to respond to it, not only as it relates to offering support services to the survivor, but also how do we engage in prevention education? Like, how do we shift those attitudes and norms to keep sexual violence from happening to begin with? There's an idea that um, that youth don't need to be taught that, or that there was just the way that youth is. And I just want to push back on that and actually challenge these school environments. We all have the power to end sexual violence. It isn't just going to happen because there's a local rape crisis center. We have to be able to address it at multiple systems. We also have to address it as it relates to how do we shift the social norms and attitudes that permit it to happen, and that permit for someone who has perpetrated an act of sexual violence to move forward without being held accountable. And I think that is a conversation that may be tough in educational settings, especially in like elementary, middle, and high school settings. But it starts from the beginning. And the sooner that we start by laying out what healthy relationships are and having the mechanisms to not only support survivors when they disclose, but mechanisms for accountability to ensure that doesn't happen again, the safer that our school environments are going to be. And I think that that's what Chanel Miller is an example of, and the repercussions that happened to Brock Turner when he perpetrated this act. It was really powerful for her as a student as well to be able to speak about the lasting implications, but it's also powerful in her story because she is able to really a terrible act has happened to her, but she has really gone forward with thinking and an attitude that this isn't going to define who I am, but it's certainly going to inform me and define of how I advocate for change at numerous systems. And that's one of the powerful things about Chanel Miller's story. It's
So let's touch on what happened to her, could bring it into context with the school situation here, and also what are your thoughts on people who know about a situation and by not doing anything on their end to help the victim, how they become actually a part of the crime because they're enablers.
it sends a strong message. I think when we talk about Chanel Miller, if you recall back, which is, when you think about it is very it despite the Me Too movement and its inroads that it's made, because it has made some meaningful inroads, we still have live in a society where the conversation when someone discloses is really centered around not ruining the perpetrator's lives. So, and not really centered it around how the perpetrator has ruined the victims' lives, right? When we talk about Brock Turner, it was kind of a lot of the conversation, a lot of the narrative was, well, she had been drinking. Are you sure that's what happened? And then he was a star swimmer. We can't ruin his life. In fact, that was when we look at the when he was subsequently convicted of the crime. You had a judge who was like, we're going to give him I think it was a 6-month jail time sentence because here we have a star athlete and we don't want to ruin their lives, and he's already paid his due. And there was never any conversation of the damage that that victim had experienced, and that at no point had ever the narrative been of how can we as a community, how can we as a system support the survivor where we can make them maybe not as whole as they were before, but closer to being whole. And I think that when you talk about often with school responses is that oftentimes the narrative is really around the perpetrator, wanting to minimize or wanting to deny or wanting to really focus on the not ruining the perpetrator's life and not really having a discussion around how do we support the survivor, how do we send a message to the survivor that we believe them and that we want to connect them to the resources that they need, but how do we send a message to the rest of the school community that this is not tolerated. You can feel safe to disclose, because oftentimes survivors don't disclose, not because they don't want to, but because they often aren't believed or they're often blamed for their own victimization. And if that's the immediate response, then we can't expect other survivors to come out of the shadows. I had a conversation about a couple of weeks ago with a local university, and we were talking about how I would want to send my daughter to a school where I see a high rate of Title IX reports. And not because I think sexual violence is occurring more on that campus, it's because it sends a message to me that something is happening on that campus that permits survivors to disclose. So anytime that I see a school that has minimal numbers, like in reporting, or low, I know that number isn't an accurate number. What that tells me is that campus, something is happening in that campus that does not permit survivors to disclose. And
So
and that doesn't make it a safe campus.
right. So part of the perpetrator's persona is they groom. So not only do they groom, they'll groom society. And I think that's part of how come often the perpetrator is let off lightly, because they've had this pattern in their life of establishing how wonderful they are.
And yes, part of it is there are some perpetrators that use this like public persona, and knowing that they can count on that, because how often, even to in today's society, do we have someone that our community has lauded as a respected individual, and then when someone discloses, then you see most of the time the community rallies themselves around the respected individual. And part of it is because I feel is that our sometimes we don't want to admit that the person that we respected or the person that we loved was capable of causing harm to someone else. But the reality is everybody's capable of being, a perpetrator. Whether they become one is a different thing,
Mhm.
right? And so I say that is because instead of starting from the visceral reaction of like, no, they couldn't have done it, it could be like, I don't, I've never observed it, and that this person is capable of doing this, and yet that doesn't mean they're not capable of doing it,
Mhm.
right? And
Yes.
I think that that's part of it. The more charming they are, there's this idea that, well, they're really charming, they're really successful, they're really like a star athlete, they're a really popular kid.
Mhm.
Why would they want to do this?
Mhm.
And the reality is that when we talk about sexual violence and human trafficking, it's not a crime of sexual gratification. It's really a crime about power and control,
Right.
and sex is the tool to get that.
Right. Right. So tell us a little bit about Title IX. You've mentioned it a couple of times. For those of us who are not familiar with that, what is that about?
Sure. And so, in a nutshell, because it's a lot more complicated than what I'm about to
Yeah,
say,
in a
but okay. But
nutshell.
in a nutshell, it's based on the statute, the Title IX statute, the federal regs, where any school that receives federal funding has to have mechanisms to ensure that students feel safe. And sexual violence being one of them, or harassment and things like that. And so there has to be a mechanism of reporting and investigating and ensuring that students that have been impacted are safe from
Mhm.
future or acts of violence and things like that.
So, along with that and what we've just discussed, do you think that there's a hope in the future for sexual violence to not happen as much, or when it does, that survivors feel safe enough to come forward?
Yes, I do believe that, and the reason is because I've seen it. I've seen shifts in attitudes and norms, which is one of the reasons that we really strengthen our prevention education program, because sexual violence is preventable, and I know this is because we've seen other social ill wills that have shifted. I think back to when we in the 80s, when we had the Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? And in the 80s, like in the early 80s, anybody could drink a six pack of beer and get behind the wheel, and nobody would say anything different, or anything like that, and it would be fine. But what ended up happening with Mothers Against Drug Driving and the CDC, what we call the social ecological model, which is, a real focus as like a multi um, tier model, where you focus on the individual attitudes, the relationship attitudes, the systems, the policies, and it's like it's this whole spectrum like you have to hit upon. We were able to, and you saw that because you had commercials, right? You had the test dummies. You had in the high schools that would bring up like a busted up car to show that this is what can happen when you drink and drive. You had tougher penalties. You had reinforcements at the state and national level that drinking and driving is not okay. So what we saw was a shift in attitudes and norms where, hey, it's not okay for you to drink six beers and get behind the wheel.
Mhm.
And now people don't think anything wiser. When you see a friend that drinks a glass of wine, I mean, we feel very comfortable of saying, hey, are you sure you can drive? I can take you home, right? And that was because it was a concerted, long, like deep, profound investment in shifting attitudes and norms and attitudes around drinking and driving. We can do the same as it relates to sexual violence. How do we
Mhm.
teach bystander interventionists? How do we raise youth from the beginning that they start school, pre-K, of what healthy relationships are, what consent is, and what it's not, and how to be able to articulate boundaries? all of that leads to these shifts in social norms and attitudes, as well as obviously tougher laws as it relates to sexual violence, and the message being reinforced that sexual violence is not permitted, and that we uplift healthy relationships, but it has to come at numerous systems. It just can't be one of them. It's got to be a concerted effort. So I do believe it is preventable if all of us are part of the solution.
So you chose Chanel Miller this year for your annual fundraiser. And I've been to a couple of your past fundraisers, and so you're having to do it differently this year. But so tell us a little bit about that, and tell us why she was the decision that you made for this year's speaker.
Absolutely. So we have had to revamp our event. Last year, unfortunately, we had to cancel and re-scramble and make it into a virtual event. And this year, while we would have had the hope that the event would have been held in person, we also recognize that, our health is paramount and that we all play a responsibility. And so we decided to just go ahead and go virtual. And it's exciting because for us, to a certain degree, is that we make the event more accessible to folks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be held virtually via Crowdcast. And if anybody participated in our last year's Amber Tamlin, it's the same platform that we used. And we have Jane Kramer, who is a local favorite performer, being the performing artist at the event. And we hope that this event is one that can be interactive with questions, but it is going to be kind of a Q&A, moderated conversation with her. The reason we selected her is because she has such a powerful tale to unfold between our community. Oftentimes, you do not get survivors that are engaged through the criminal justice system in the way that she did, from reporting all the way to conviction. And she has got an insight. She's going to be able to pull the curtain on what that experience is like for survivors, because oftentimes survivors either don't engage with the criminal justice system or start to engage with the criminal justice system, and then no longer choose to engage with the criminal justice system, right? And they often don't talk about those experiences of why. But Chanel Miller can explain, tell her story of what that experience was like. But it's also an opportunity for her to shed light on what does it mean for a community to band together to say this is not okay, that there needs to be some accountability. Because if you may recall, as a result of Chanel Miller and her coming forth, they ended up recalling that judge that wanted to protect the perpetrator because he didn't want to ruin his life. They recalled them, and they were able to vote in another judge that was willing to take sexual violence cases more seriously. And the other reason we decided to select Chanel Miller is because she also reflects a lot of the experience of college students and Title IX. We have a new administration under the Biden administration that we are certainly looking forward to having stronger Title IX protections, the ones that were eroded under the previous administration. And I think that's really important to highlight, as well as the fact is that a lot of the victimizations of young women happened during college. And so to really highlight that part. But most importantly, the other piece is that she's going to highlight how she used art as a modality for healing, because that is very much a part of her journey. So she's going to talk about how healing is possible, and she's going to be able to talk about how her journey of healing and the importance of art and how that played a role in it.
Well, this is a very important fundraiser for Our Voice, and we want to let people know that it's going to be happening on March 11th. It's going to be virtual. The fee is $25 for adults, and students can access that for $10. It's an important fundraiser for Our Voice. So, and this is a probably somewhat experimental at this point in doing it in using this platform. I remember the Me Too event a couple of years ago, and that room was absolutely packed, and it was wonderful to see so many people out there. So I'm hoping that you'll get maybe even more, just because it's virtual and people can access it from the comfort of their home. So do you have any closing thoughts on this you want to share with our viewers? So we are streaming this live right now on YouTube and Facebook, but we'll also be airing this interview during drive time several times before March 11th. So let's hear your closing thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So we want to invite the whole community to come and be a part of this really informative and transformative event. The event I did not mention before, but it's also going to be accessible for Spanish speakers, because we want to make the event accessible to all communities. But you had mentioned it before. It is our largest fundraiser of the year, and it helps support the many important, like, critical programs that we have, and one of them really being our prevention education programs and our counseling services as well. So I would like to invite everybody to join us, spread the word, help spread the word. The more that we can be a part of this conversation, so we can all learn of how we can be a part of the solution. Because again, it goes back to, our voice is only a partial conduit to the solution. It's actually the community solution. So I would invite you to join us on March 11th. Details on our website, and details on this recording as well.
Yes, thank you. So yes, and so if someone wants to go ahead in advance and make a donation, I'm sure that they can find that the ability of how to do that on Our Voices website. And you are on social media, so you do have a presence on Facebook. And we want to thank you for what you do for the community, Angelica. It's very important, and you're welcome to come back anytime. And I think it's much easier now that we're able to do it virtually.
Well, so we're going to have to do it more often. Believe you me.
It's easier. It's easier.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much. Yeah. Goodbye from WPVM 1037.